Welcome, everyone. I'm Victor Grant, your host of Success Mastermind Hangout, and we have a very special event tonight about the secrets of successful relationships. And with us today, we have the Marriage Therapy Institute experts, Dr. Mark Schwartz and Lori Galperin. And here they are on camera. Welcome to the webinar. The camera's on you.
Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to read a little bit about your bio here. Dr. Mark Schwartz has spent more than 30 years studying human intimacy, interning at the famed Masters and Johnson Institute right out of college. Dr. Schwartz went on to become the leading director of the Institute along with Lori Galperin, MSW, until it closed in the late 90s. Having worked closely for years with William H. Masters and Virginia E. Johnson, Masters and Johnson pioneered research into the structure of human sexual response and the diagnosis and treatment of human sexual and intimacy disorders and dysfunctions. Dr. Schwartz's personal passion for human relationships and the disorders that get in the way of our ability to love one another and experience deep intimacy and connection is the driving passion behind his 30 years as a researcher, therapist, counselor, and expert in the field. Having been featured in countless television programs and magazines, and having lectured worldwide to both practitioners and the public at large, Dr. Schwartz is now based in Monterey, California, where he manages his own private practice at the Marriage Therapy Institute. He hosts marriage vacation retreats for marriage in crisis and has just opened his new transitional living center for those recovering once and for all from addiction at Harmony Place, Monterey. So welcome.
Thank you.
So tell me a little bit, what was it like working with William Masters and Johnson? Many people who are watching us have seen the television show Masters of Sex, and they've heard about Masters and Johnson. Anyone who's in relationships or sex therapy or anything like that has read his books and knows his work. And how is the Masters and Johnson method different than other forms of counseling? So camera's on you if you want to just share some of that background and your story. And then I know we have a great PowerPoint presentation for you right after that. But just say a few words about what was it like, really being there at the forefront of this sexual revolution.
Now, when I got there, we were interested in the idea of doing sex therapy. And you have to imagine at a time when psychoanalysis was at their heyday and the average person would go to therapy for a sexual problem for maybe a year, once a week, what they were saying was that they had a very high success rate in working with sexual problems when they worked with people for only 10 days. And nobody believed that to be possible, so they collected data and had 5-year follow-up, which no one had at the time. And they were able to show not only were they effective, but the effectiveness maintained itself. And what I want to talk about today with Lori is that we've been able to continue that model, but really integrate a lot of the great innovations that have occurred over the last 25 years in the marital therapy field into a lot of work we're doing. And now we're really focused on doing marital work as well as sexual work, but applying a lot of the Masters and Johnson principles. So what we'll have to say today, I think, will be new. I think it will be different than what most people are used to, and it's an application of the Masters and Johnson model to working with couples. Okay. Yeah. First time she's ever been quiet.
Yeah, that's a wonderful introduction. The very beginning of this, we had some other people who were in the Hangout joining us. So some of the things you said at the very beginning were a little bit muffled. Could you say that again? Just the very beginning. You were saying you were 20 years old, and that's the part that we missed.
Okay. Well, again, you have to imagine yourself, just getting out of graduate school. And, the Masters and Johnson was very small. There were maybe, 7 or 8 people doing the work. And so you walk in there, like fresh out of Johns Hopkins, and they put a white coat on you, and they begin to be doing research in each of the rooms on some aspect of human sexuality, and you would be walking in the rooms, sort of taking test tubes or being able to be watching people have some sort of sexual interplay, and everything had to be professional and beyond reproach. And so there was no room for giggling or personal talk, and everything was hard science. And so you'd leave there and you'd say, you'd go home to people and you want to be able to say, you won't believe what the hell my day was like. And of course, nobody did. So what I want to talk about today is what the Masters and Johnson model consisted of, and then how we have flipped it over the years and how we now apply it. What Lori and I do in Monterey is that we see couples for usually about 7 days. We have one session in the morning for an hour and a half and one session in the afternoon for an hour and a half. And we do this for 7 days. And then we give them homework assignments to do during the day and during the night, where they get a chance to practice new ways of interacting, and in the Buddhist tradition are able to practice a new discipline. Lori oftentimes says this, that if you want to learn to play the piano, you can't just go play the piano. You have to practice every day until you develop these new habits. And the problem with marital therapy is that people come once a week, they're introduced to new skills, but they don't get a chance either to rehearse them or to practice them with supervision. So you need more coaching and more of the practicing that's necessary. So in the morning session, what we do is we work on skills and focus the skills on where we see the problem with the couple. Then in the afternoon session, we do individual therapy to look at the blocks to intimacy. And those blocks are usually within the individual. So each individual is seen in one of those afternoon sessions with the partner in the room. So the partner gets the advantage of being able to do that. So what's so great is that we both do couples work and individual work, but we're doing it on the same day. We get a lot of change quickly, and then they get to go out and practice it 10 hours a day. So if you think about it, you're going to get 3 hours of therapy with Lori and I, and then you're going to be practicing 10 hours a day. That's 13 hours of therapy in a single day over a 7-day period. That's almost a year's worth of work in a week. Now that was the Masters and Johnson model. What we did is we worked with people intensively, and as they changed, it produced tremendous enthusiasm and hope, and that enthusiasm and hope energized further change and further change. And so we could work with couples who really had fallen out of love with each other many times, and in a very small period of time, reignite many of the original feelings they had of passion and love for one another.
So just to go back to the original Masters and Johnson, Dr. Masters always would say that when he first began to think that it might be a public health epidemic, sexual dysfunction, before he dared to contemplate designing a program to treat sexual dysfunction, he thought it might be important to figure out what actually constituted sexual function. And that really wasn't understood at the time, hence the research. And once there was a model for understanding healthy sexual function, what became apparent is that it's not a question of learning technique, although it's certainly always good to know where things are. Speaking of the clitoris, for example. However, things are not just about geography, and things are not just about technique. Things are about really looking at whatever it is that actually inhibits natural function, because Mother Nature herself is incredibly robust when it comes to sexuality and sensuality between two people in a reasonable state of good health who have attraction for one another. So the Masters and Johnson approach was to actually be able to look at the roadblocks that came in between a couple and their ability to have optimal sexual functioning and intimate functioning with one another. So I was stunned when I first began to work with this model because I never would have imagined that what was clearly possible in a 10-day to 2-week period of time could be possible. But as I became a therapist and practiced over a 28-year period of time now, it's as Mark is saying, what I see is that even in marital therapy where people are desperate and maybe have excellent therapists, still that week intervening between sessions allows people to undo things that are done. And so each week it's like you put a brick in the wall and then a brick gets taken out, put in the same brick, it gets taken out. And so I think people spiral into a sense of hopelessness. And so the Masters and Johnson approach, I think, is one that's incredibly useful for any couple, actually, not just couples in crisis.
Okay, so let's go back to the Masters and Johnson model. What it consisted of, since it was really ancient history at this point, was number one, we would see two people, a couple, and the relationship was the focus of therapy. And what Masters would say is that there are three patients. There's him, there's her, and there's them. And we have to focus on all three simultaneously. Second point was that they used co-therapists. So there's a male and female team, and Lori and I have worked together for 25, 30 years now as a co-therapy team. And where I deal with him, Lori deals with her, and both of us deal with the relationship. And the advantage of that, as most of you know, is that so often when you're working with a couple, they feel like the therapist is biased, and that they're just mad at all women, or they're mad at all men, or they're siding with one person or siding with the other person. But we form a really deep relationship on a same-sex basis. And so what Masters used to say was that it's the ability to form that relationship with the client that gives you permission to be able to confront. And so when I confront the client that what they're doing is destructive or not congruent with their goals, he calls that holding up the mirror. When I'm holding up the mirror, the fact that I have such a strong relationship with the man allows him to be able to tolerate a high degree of confrontation. But there has to be a balance between the amount I support him and the amount that we confront him. So a lot of the technique of Masters and Johnson was dancing through confrontation and support, being able to say, here's what you want, here's what you came here for, here's what you're doing. If you continue to do that, you're not going to get what you came here for. Here's how to do it differently. Are you interested? If so, go out and practice it today, see that it works, and then you'll see for yourself that you can begin to reach the goals that you've set. So the dual-sex team was a really critical component. And then finally, in a short-term model, what we're interested in was being very directed. And so in a longer-term therapy, you can have the luxury of letting the person slowly discover what it is that they need to discover about themselves. But in a short-term 7-day therapy, you have to say, this is what we see you doing, this is what we see the consequences of what you're doing, this is probably why you're doing it. And so because we've done a very detailed history, what we find is that the problem that most people bring to the therapy room is not the problem that they really have. And so they may come in and they say, oh, we're having communication problems, or he had an affair, or she doesn't really show affection. And that's a problem, but it's typically not the problem. The problem has much more to do with the family of origin. And what happens in the family of origin is that the way a person is loved as a child lays a blueprint, and then they repeat those same patterns in adulthood. And that really gets us more into the Harville Hendricks kind of work of being able to understand how these, what Hendricks called the imago, gets somehow transplanted onto the relationship and reenacted and repeated in a variety of ways. So much of the problem is not just the here and now, but the then and there. And so as we've done new innovations, what we've tried to do is one of our sessions is dealing with the then and there, and one of our sessions is dealing with the here and now. And having 2 sessions a day allows us to be able to do that.
Yeah, I would say that in brief, you know, we're part of a culture that's fairly ahistorical. So a lot of us function under the illusion that we're not impacted by our past. But actually, if one studies the attachment literature and developmental psychology, you realize that, as I believe Daniel Stern said, the first relationship forms a template for all relationships to come. And so, essentially, even if one seeks to find something very different than what you had originally, the possibility of actually finding it and sustaining it is often circumscribed by things that have much more to do with unfinished business from the past than they actually have to do with deficits in the current relationship. So, as Mark says, it's important to work at all levels. Certainly when couples come in and they say they need help with communication, it's absolutely true. And you absolutely have to provide them with communication skills and tools that work better than what's not working currently. And at the same time, often people have a very hard time actually taking in what they seem to want most. And that's one thing Harville Hendricks talks about in his book, Receiving Love, is that the ways in which people, and this is what Dr. Masters knew way back when, the ways in which people go 2 directions at once, both desperately seeking intimacy and at the same time simultaneously creating blocks to ever actually being able to take in and enjoy and savor and luxuriate in that intimacy.
When I began to work with Masters and Johnson, Richard Stewart had just written his book, Helping Couples Change. Jacobson had written his book, Cognitive Behavioral Therapy for Marriages. And there was a whole variety of approaches that suggested cognitive behavioral therapy, communication skills training, and active listening kinds of work was what was critical for marriages. And what we found was that all that was necessary, but really sufficient. And we had a high treatment failure rate. And so when Gottman published his work, The Marriage Clinic, and said that under traditional marriage approaches, the divorce rate was extremely high, and we had a technique that was very unsuccessful, that's consistent with what we had discovered. And so we all went back to the drawing board, and we said cognitive behavioral work clearly is necessary, but not sufficient. So one session has to be dealing with the relationship and teaching people problem-solving skills, recreation skills, how to have fun, how to play, how to have intimacy, how to enjoy themselves, how to be able to make the relationship a priority, how to be able to deal with children, how to be able to deal with anger, all those wonderful skills. And certainly, you know, most people really need training on how to be able to manage a complex relationship in this day and age. And all that is necessary, but rarely sufficient. Now, the question is, what else is necessary? And there have been 2 major changes in the field that have answered that for us. The first is the work that has been done in beginning to look at relationships from an intrapsychic perspective. Intrapsychic as opposed to interpsychic. Interpsychic means what goes on between the 2 of us. Intrapsychic means what goes on within the individual. And as we began to work more and more with trauma victims, what we found was that there was a dissociative system whereby the individuals had one part of self that had one set of goals, another part of self that had another set of goals. And interesting enough, at the same time, there was this work that had derived from Bowlby and Mary Ainsworth and Mary Main that had suggested that individuals, oftentimes when they come from a history of complex trauma, which is highly endemic in our society, have a part of self which is highly preoccupied in attachment, meaning that when they get anxious, they cling, while simultaneously being avoidant in attachment, meaning that when they get anxious, they want to isolate. And so what we began to see are these what we call structural kinds of problems, where when people got into relationship, it was like an accordion that would come together and they would move close and then go away. And they'd do this dance where one person would become a merger, the other one would become a seeker. And one became a seeker, the other one became a merger. And, you know, that they would drive each other crazy. And it would look almost like what was called borderline personality at the time. But in truth, within the same individual, you would find people who move between them. Now, Patricia Crittenden calls that the AC pattern that she got from Mary Ainsworth. The AC pattern is a lot, when people are heavily into preoccupied pattern, they're heavily into affect. They feel emotional. When they're in an avoiding pattern, they're highly into cognition and intellect. And so they get driven between their feelings, which is I'm lonely, I'm alone, I need to connect, and cognition. I'm afraid if I get too close to somebody, they're going to hurt me. Other people have hurt me, and their protectors jump in. And so it's this dance between come closer, go away. And as we've understood that, what we've begun to do is see that the intrapsychic intimacy is that a lot of people just hate themselves. They think of themselves as defective, bad, damaged, shameful. And if you hate yourself, it's really hard to have another person love you, because there's sort of a positive and negative on your magnet, where if they love you, you're going to prove to them that you're unlovable, and you go out and have an affair or go and watch pornography or whatever. And so what we began to realize is that these symptoms that people bring in, compulsive pornography, internet kinds of stuff, and affairs, and getting into workaholism, and so on, alcoholism and drugs, and even eating disorder, that so many of these are people who are, on one hand, incredibly lonely and disconnected even from themselves, and terrified and need the addiction to be able to have something to connect to, while simultaneously having all this desperate need for someone to love them, but being terrified of it.
Yeah, if you think about our society and its highly addictive nature, I'm not simply talking about drugs, alcohol, internet porn. I mean workaholism and the acquisition of things and having to achieve more and more and more and more, or compulsive caretaking of others as a way of life, so that people become comforted by an activity or a substance or a thing when they're feeling insecure, when they're feeling lonely. And, you know, this was the secret stronghold of males for many generations. It's that, you know, a lot of people say, oh, well, you know, my father was a great father. He worked all the time and he was rarely there, but, you know, he met our needs and he worked hard so that he could meet our needs optimally because he wanted us to have what he didn't have. Well, maybe that's part of the explanation. But another part of the explanation for a lot of men, as they ultimately are able to say, is that it's a whole lot easier to handle the problems in a work environment. It's much more contained, and there's some possibility of problem solving with an outcome that can be measured within a reasonable period of time, whereas being a partner, whereas parenting is kind of an open-ended, long-term, confusing, intricate, complex activity, and it's really hard to measure how you're doing. And so nowadays, you know, women have joined men, and in this sense of being occupied so much in so many areas that intimacy becomes something that there just isn't room for. And even though we all yearn for things that are about relationship and depth and being seen and known, it may be also the most enormous fear we have. of being actually truly seen and known. I mean, that's the big secret, is that one of the big secrets is that everybody desperately wants to be seen and known. And most people are also equally desperately afraid of actually being seen and known. And that contradiction is often what haunts many relationships.
So I like this slide because what you see in this slide is what I call dead eyes. She's a school teacher, he's an accountant. They have 1.6 children, and they have their lives, and they come home and they cook their dinner and they take care of their child and then they do a little homework and so on. And they come in and they come in with a number of complaints. They could come in saying they don't love each other anymore, they want a divorce. They could come in saying that he watches pornography every night at 3 o'clock in the morning. They could come in saying that she doesn't have an orgasm. And they could come in and they would say that their life is empty and this is all there is. They might say they're lonely, that they spend their time with themselves and that they don't understand, since they got a new BMW and they have a beautiful flat, why is it that they feel so unhappy? They're probably both on antidepressants, and for some reason they don't seem to be working right, so maybe they need to change their dosage, right? So the question is, why isn't the antidepressant working? Why is he doing pornography, and so on and so on? That's why I say I think the problem that people present is rarely the problem. And I can look and I can say they have dead eyes and that they're alone. Now, what do we know about these folks? Well, what we know is that they have a pattern of avoidant attachment. In avoidant attachment, when they did research with adolescents who had avoidant attachment, this is what they reported. Number one, that they weren't that interested in relationships. And they, as you can see on the pattern on the left side, that when they got into relationships, they found themselves doing it because their peers said it was fun, but not because they were really interested. They had difficulty falling in love. When they had sex for the first time, they felt kind of numb. They would say things like, you know, I don't get it. Why is everyone so interested in sex? You know, when I touch somebody, it feels like I'm touching a blackboard or something. I don't seem to get much out of it. Now, avoidant attachment is like that, where there's a numbness and where there's a block. Now, if we go back to the Masters and Johnson model, what Lori said earlier was that the key to the Masters and Johnson model was that everybody was born with the capacity to feel, and the capacity to make love, and the capacity to love. Everyone has that capacity. But something happens growing up that blocks that capacity. And oftentimes it's in the early attachment environment. And so Lori and I became very interested in trying to understand how you take people who have these attachment problems and make them move to what Mary Main called earned secure attachment. In other words, if we were stuck in these attachment patterns for life and they were unchangeable, then most of us would be pretty well doomed because it's highly endemic in our society. People can move to a secure attachment environment, but what are the ingredients of helping people move to a secure attachment environment? And what our answer to that is falling in love. When you fall in love, the relationship has the capacity to begin to provide the nurturing environment to move somebody from a pattern of avoidant attachment to a more secure attachment pattern. And so our goal is to be able to use the relationship as a vehicle for change. That was the Masters and Johnson model. Use the relationship as a vehicle for change. Now you say, well, how does that happen? But think about yourself for a minute. What happened when you fell in love for the first time? What you found out was that you became more yourself. That things that you became more aware of things about yourself that were destructive. Things that you did that were destructive. I'll use myself as an example if you don't mind. I had a pattern of what I would call preoccupied attachment. And in my preoccupied attachment pattern, what I believed was that she should be like me. And if I load the dishwasher a certain way, she should load the dishwasher a certain way. If I wanted to go out and go to Target, she should want to go out and go to Target. If I wanted to see an action movie, she should want to see an action movie.
If you wanted to be there early, I should be there early.
Now, you could call that narcissistic, but it would actually be closer to a very preoccupied pattern, because the mistake is to believe that she and I are the same person. She and I are not the same person. And so, therapists call that having boundaries. And when having boundaries, what you have is a sense of secure attachment with yourself. She has a secure attachment with herself, which then allows each of us to interact with integrity and respect. And I'm able to say, this is what I want. She's able to say, this is what I want. And each of us then finds a way to be able to live together, given the fact that we're separate individuals. But the mistake that most people make with preoccupied attachment is they think the other person should be like them. And of course, it's a fundamental flaw. So in order to be able to do that, I had to become more differentiated and integrated as an individual. And as we got into the relationship and the relationship progressed, and I felt safe enough and secure enough, I could begin to do some of my own work and finish the differentiation process that had not been finished in childhood. And so as that happened, I became stronger as an individual, which made the relationship stronger. Now, using that introspection, the question is, how can a therapist who's coming in intervene and help the individual differentiate to a much greater degree so that they don't need the other person to be a replica or a duplicate of themselves?
It's a good question. Well, I think that one piece of the answer is that when couples come in, actually often things have deteriorated to a point where they're each blaming one another for the distress. And secretly, internally, each is blaming themselves, or at least holding out the possibility that actually it's them. So in the very beginning, in taking the history and then reflecting to each client, to the couple together, reflecting each client's history and their, if you will, relational evolution to that point, and then the history of the couple as a couple, what has to become clear to them is that they almost couldn't be any other place than where they precisely are. So the idea as a therapist is you actually do want to understand, how did these two people get to this point? Because if you want to disentangle the knot, you have to see where it's knotted. So looking at a person's history, you're looking at the things that happened that maybe happened too soon, that maybe happened to be too much before the person was equipped for it. You're looking at the things that also didn't happen, that the person desperately needed in order to unfold optimally. And it's not as though you're blaming anyone, but you certainly have to look intergenerationally at what all the different sort of inheritances emotionally were. And it's interesting to think about it, because if you think about America, you think about the history of America, a lot of people came here, number one, to escape oppression. That would be true with my grandparents, for example, and the oppression that they were seeking to flee was, the kind of lethal oppression that nowadays exists in, say, the Democratic Republic of the Congo. So, many of us had forebears, our grandparents, who fled tremendous, dangerous, lethal oppression and barely got out, and some of the relatives didn't get out, and came to this country and started over with nothing, not able to speak the language, no frame of reference, and, in circumstances of less than poverty. And then other of our forebears were actually brought to the country in chains, and their oppression only began in deepened form once they got here. And didn't end until it did end. In my lifetime, for example, things were largely unchanged when I was a child in many ways growing up in the South. So now a generation or two generations is not enough to resolve the magnitude of oppression that many of our immediate forebears experienced. And it's not as though they didn't do the best they could. They may have well done the absolute best they could, but there wouldn't have been time in that environment of survival to deal with the intricacies of the psychological. They just had to survive. And then in the next generation, there was a different unfolding, and people sought to create, I think, many times distance from the old world and to act as if it had never happened. So there were things you were supposed to remember and never forget, but really not talk about the details. So it's amazing to me how little some of my clients actually know about their parents' history until they get into therapy, and I encourage them to begin to ask questions. And sometimes their parents are at a point where they're much more able to be open about things that were never known. And the things that were never known in a family's legacy often really explain a great deal of places that were constricted, where the family itself generationally had an issue and had a right to have an issue based on the things that had happened. So you're looking at what went on in this person's life, what they were heir to originally, how that interfaced with environmental circumstances and their temperament and every other factor, and how that created both the strengths that you see in them and perhaps the limitations that are what get them there, but how it created their uniqueness in a way, how it created the unfolding of the reality of their most unique self, and how it also constrained the unfolding of their most unique self. And then you're looking at how these two people came together. So how did these two unique puzzle pieces, if you will, come together and fit? There's a concept in psychology called interlocking psychodynamics, basically. So you're looking at how people fit together. So often couples get together not just to repeat dysfunctional patterns, but they get together because maybe they're picking one of the particular human beings on the face of the planet who is uniquely formed in a way that actually interlocks with many of their strengths and many of their places that have yet to heal. And so to begin to reframe and put them on a road to being able to utilize the relationship as the vehicle it may well have been intended to for healing is actually a tremendous kind of sacred trust. So you're actually getting the couple to look at the things that happened to them, the things that happened to their forebears, the attachment environment that was created by virtue of all different factors, how that impacted them in their personal evolutionary unfolding and allowed certain things and constrained other things, how they came together with this other unique individual with their own unique history, and what they formed together, both in ways that may have profoundly worked originally and in ways that hit a blind alley somewhere on the path and that they don't know how to work around. And by the time you get through with the history and recounting it to the couple, optimally what should happen is that they feel somewhat seen and known, and more seen and known by the other, and they're not blaming either one another nor themselves. It's like, it's like that old commercial about V8 juice where the guy goes, I could have had a V8. It's like, how could it be otherwise? Of course we're here. And when the shame falls away from that and the blame falls away with it, a couple actually has a chance to begin to work and to begin to actually use the relationship as the vehicle for change.
Okay, so what Lori's saying is the first step is to be able to use your incredible assessment and history taking and relationship with the client It helped them both look at themselves as individuals and as a couple. Masters and Johnson called that the round table. In the round table, you're holding up the mirror and showing them what happened to each of them and what they did to themselves as a result of that, and how they came together and what they recreated that brought them into your office. That's always the first step. Okay, so that's the first step. Now, you're asking the question, okay, Mark, what we're saying makes sense to us, that but how in 7 days can you repair an attachment system? And how can you work with someone in such a short period of time and move them in the direction of secure attachment? What's the secret? And the answer to that is that in the individual session, what one has to do is to begin to look at what they disowned in their own life and re-own that which they disowned in order to become integrated and to begin to unleash the self. And so Dick Schwartz in his internal family systems model said something very similar to what Masters said, which is that we're born with a sense of self, that things happen growing up where we get hurt, and put clouds out so that the self doesn't get a chance to unfold or differentiate. And the key of therapy is to remove the clouds and allow the self to be able to unfold. Well, Masters and Johnson said very similarly that the capacity for intimacy, the capacity for relationship, the capacity for connection, we're all born with, but something blocks it. And of course, the attachment people are saying the same thing, that there is that capacity for secure attachment, that something happens in life that blocks it from occurring in some ways. So in the contemporary therapies that are more trauma-based, what you're doing is you're getting away from cognitive-based therapies and you're moving towards affect-based therapies. EMDR, internal family systems, Gestalt work, psychodrama, psychomotor therapy, and so on. Those therapies are heavily affect-oriented. And what they're based upon is that when someone feels like they're defective, like they're bad, like they're injured for life, like they deserve bad things to happen to them, they hate themselves. These are affectively engraved into the brain. And that what one has to do is activate the very core of when those emotions got frozen in, and cognitive bases begin to affectively, cognitively challenge that. And so in the afternoon sessions, what we're beginning to do is help the person begin to look at the context of what happened to them, the trauma model, and the source of what happened to them, and begin to challenge that belief system about self, and begin to change the very engraving in the brain by forming new pathways, top down, to begin to see themselves differently, and to look in their partner's eyes and see their reflection, and see that their partner loves them despite the fact that they weigh too much or weigh too little, or have a big nose or have a little nose, or makes mistakes, or doesn't make $100,000 a year, or doesn't drive a fancy car, that you're lovable because of who you are, not because of what you do or what you've been able to achieve or how pretty your face is.
Just a side note, if sorry to interrupt, but there's a lot of questions coming in here, and some people asked they couldn't see the slides, and I just put the ability to download that PDF back up on screen. So if you want to click that button that says download the PDF, or if you're watching the replay, you're going to want to opt in with your name and email address, and then that PDF of the slides will be sent to you. Just a little side note for you. We'll go ahead and continue the presentation. And there's a ton of questions. Just let me know when you're ready. I'll bring those questions up from the audience. Thanks. And if you want to ask a question, there's still time. So go and write your question in the comments section right below this video. Okay, back to you.
Okay, thanks, Victor. Yeah, I look forward to taking the questions. Let's see if we can give you a little bit more information that may answer a few of them. first. So this picture always reminds me of, you know, a romance novel. I suspect that's where it's taken from. And sometimes in the profession, we think of romance novels as sort of, you know, heterosexual female pornography, because it's the way in which women, still some, objectify men. It's like, you know, this man is the male version of the centerfold, I suppose, and he's the modern day version of Prince Charming. And I think one problem is the way in which some idea we have of some standardized portrayal of success or beauty or desirability becomes superimposed over real human beings who have much greater dimensionality and depth than this character, or these two characters in this particular romance novel. So let's go into that a bit more deeply and bring it into the attachment environment. So let's say you're growing up and you are a boy and you are sensitive and you were interested in the art and you're not as much into sports as your brothers. And you're growing up in a mainstream homophobic place with sexual stereotypes that are narrow. Think about what you're going to need to disown in order to be safe, in order to feel approved of, in order to not become vulnerable in ways that could be unfortunate, in ways that just don't even net you the resources of your attachment environment. And in any environment, it's, you know, idiosyncratic. What it is a person has to become more of and become less of, what they can identify with in their makeup, and what they have to disidentify with in order to receive love and approval. It's as idiosyncratic as the culture, the neighborhood, the school district, the socioeconomic class, the family itself, the generational issues, and how all of those come together to form the constellation. And in that matrix, a person automatically moves to adapt and disowns what's undesirable, quote unquote undesirable. Then we grow up, ostensibly, and we meet another person. Often, that other person actually possesses many of the qualities that we were forced to yield up. And so we see in them something that enlivens us and makes us, in a way, hopeful. And we think it's about them, but very often it's about something that got not much airtime for us, and it's underdeveloped, and it longs for life. So, for example, let's say hypothetically that Mark and I met, and is this okay for a hypothetical? And let's say that what Mark really likes about me is that I'm emotional and I cry when I watch TV shows that are really sad, and I express my feelings, and I'm animated, etc., etc. And I have the capacity to love deeply, hypothetically. And let's say what I really like about him and really respect about him, among many other things, is that he's highly effective. You know, he is unflappable, that he can handle situations. He's just in control. And let's say, hypothetically, we get married and the years move on. Well, what may happen, and often happens with couples, is that the very things that each of us really admired and was attracted to originally are the very things that now frustrate us. So now, years later, hypothetically, he can't stand my emotionality, and he becomes even more aloof and focuses even more on things that he does effectively. and let's say I'm just damn sick of that, and I wish he would quit doing all those things effectively and being so damn remote, and so I want to get a reaction out of him. So I get more emotional, and as I get more emotional, he gets more remote. And, you know, eventually we wind up in the therapist's office having hurl things at each other like, you know, what the fuck is wrong with you? Aren't you even human? And like, why do you have to be so emotional? My God, grow up. And it's just a tragedy. But what typically happens is that if each person, this is called projective identification. I don't know who first discovered it, so I'm sorry I can't give credit to the originator. But the concept of projective identification is just what I've been saying, that somehow you see in the other something disowned from yourself. And originally maybe you love it, and eventually you come to hate it as you get polarized with it. And the only way out of that, and perhaps why you actually wound up with this person originally, is that how it could work differently is that two people could inspire one another, and one could begin to balance the polarization internally and begin to re-own the disowned parts of self and begin to have a safe place in which that becomes possible, so that within yourself you become more of a balance of qualities where no parts of oneself have to be hated and exiled. That would be the ideal. Probably very few people are there yet. Maybe the Dalai Lama, maybe a few other people. But that would be the ideal, is to create the safety and the conversation and the interplay and the inspiration and the patience to re-own what had to be disowned once upon a time. And when people are able to do that, the relationship deepens. You know, many people say they get bored in relationships, but how can that actually happen when a person is continuing to evolve and deepen? When a person is getting to know aspects of themselves that were unknown, how do they become boring? But when a person has to be some stereotyped, unidimensional cardboard cutout of what success looks like, you know, patterned along the lines of something they read in a magazine while waiting for the grocery checkout lane to move, that's like two objects, an object having sex with another object. And that can be fun initially, but then it does get old ultimately. So the only way is to deepen and to re-own.
Okay, now I want to get fairly pragmatic here because people always want to sort of have a cookbook of how you do it. So let me see if I can outline this 1, 2, 3, 4. Step 1 is you incorporate the work of Gottman, of Carl Hendricks, Dan Wiley, Richard Stewart, Susan Johnson, and Neil Jacobson, and you work on skill packages. And we have, you know, a 10-page package on problem-solving skills, intimacy skills, communication skills, anger management skills, and so on. And they read it intellectually. We then have them practice exercises, and then we have them rehearse it, and then we have them practice as a discipline like they've practiced in the piano. And then our first session of the day is spent in helping them be able to deal with their solvable problems, their unsolvable problems, and so on. And then I think Gottman's work with them is ingenious, and they've helped us all enormously with understanding, both from a research and a pragmatic way, some of these patterns. And you know, all fit marital therapists need to incorporate that. And I'm saying that's necessary but not sufficient. Now, part 2 of this is beginning to work with the relationship. So what you're doing is, in individual therapy, you're stealing intimacy because you and the individual in the room are becoming intimate, and it's stealing it from the spouse. But in this, you're seeing the couple and you're facilitating the intimacy. How are you doing that? Well, if Lori is working with a woman, and she's doing a piece of individual deep work, and the woman is high into feelings and emotions, and the man's in the room listening, what happens is they'll leave the room, they'll go down to the coffee shop, and they'll begin to discuss the sessions, and oftentimes they're talking about things they've never talked about in the 25 years of their marriage. They're sharing emotions and feelings. They're having in vivo a real experience of intimacy. So instead of the therapist feeling the intimacy, they're actually facilitating it between the couple. Now, what does Lori's session look like? Well, it could be a variety of things. For example, let's say the woman comes in and she gives a history of when she was 12 years old, she watched her father take a knife to her mother in front of her two young sisters. And father was drunk and attempted to kill the mother. And she said to herself at 12 years old, I hate men, I never want to marry a man, and I just need to take care of myself. I never want to depend upon a man for anything. So these become the core belief systems that the person has sort of engraved in their brain. And so they come 20 years later, 10 years later, and they pick, they're, let's say, an attorney for a firm where they're doing criminal cases and really tough, and they come in, and you can almost guess what their spouse is going to look like and what the problem is going to be, because like Lori said, the person is going to recreate and enact. And so probably she's going to pick someone who would be somewhat like her father, I think, or like her mother, one or the other. And so either the man will be helpless and unable to take care of himself, like the mother will be unemployed, or if it's her second marriage, he might be a judge who's mean and nasty and heavily controlling. But whatever it is, it probably is not about him and her at the time. What's happened is the trauma of the past has not been worked through, and she picked a partner to help her quite finish what it is that's unfinished, or try to solve her life problems. And her first marriage didn't work, her second marriage didn't work, and she's stuck. So what Lori's going to do is she's going to work with her on what happened to her at age 12 and help her understand what she's recreated in her relationship and what she had to disown. Because as you talk to this woman, she'll say something like, what I really want is just a man to take care of me. But I'll be hell-bent if I can trust any man. Well, there's a contradictory need. On one hand, as a child, she didn't have her nurturing needs met. She didn't get parented from age 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 in the way she needed to be parented. And so much of her structural adaptation in the development of self has been not unfolded. And so she has a false self that is, the lawyer and is living the life of a lawyer, and the real self has been disowned in some ways. And she's now looking for a man to be able to complete that. It's never going to work. So, let's talk about what you're going to do with her.
Good question.
You can see we rehearsed this really.
I had no idea you were going there. Well, I'm going to get the different parts of self to express their feeling, and I'm going to have her witness it, and I'm going to have her husband witness it. Or we might go back to places that entrenched those particular beliefs and allow her to revisit it with some safety and partnership in a way that actually allows her to have a much more complete experience of it that feels resolving. I was stuck on the part where the spouse was going to watch and then they were going to go talk about it. And I was thinking the one statement is, if the person's feeling pain and the husband is watching, he can probably feel deep compassion only if he doesn't feel responsible for her pain. And I think that that's actually one important component of the therapy, is that by the time we're doing this work, the two people have recreated a sense of partnership, not for the long term necessarily, but in the process of the therapy. And so the person actually feels like they have a friend and witness for the first time maybe in a long time. I think sometimes when people quote unquote fall in love, it's not that love is blind. It's that actually more of the real self of the individual dares to come forth, because initially it feels safe. Initially it feels like they're accepted and loved, and then over time things reconstrict, and parts of self have to be redisowned, and people go back into this narrow existence with one another. And so when you remove the shame and the self-blame and the blame of one another, partnership can re-emerge. And then the two people aren't trying to figure out whose fault it is. They're trying to actually be involved in a process of healing together and be facilitated and be, in a way, best friends again.
But in that individual work that I'm alluding to, sometimes you include trauma work. And, you know, the treatment for trauma work is exposure-based therapies, and having people re-experience when the moments where they found that they needed to turn themselves off in order to survive, where they learned to stop loving, and where they learned to hate themselves. And as they go back and revisit that place and time, then they can begin in a dissociative way to begin to use the adult self to begin to reconnect and reparent this injured part of self, and make a commitment to loving oneself and taking care of oneself in a self-sufficient way, becoming self-reliant. In that place, they become more integrated. And as they become more integrated and more secure, then they do not need to turn to the other to save them. Instead, they need to turn to the other to love them and support them in varieties of ways. So if you get my point, what we're trying to do is work with intrapsychic intimacy, with one's capacity to love oneself, while simultaneously working with interpsychic intimacy, the capacity to love with one another. And as they love each other in the evenings, it gives them, the individual, the sense of safety and security to be able to do the individual work. The next day we may work with the man and look at where he learned to become half dead and the things that happened in his life that numbed him out. So many men I see have been in the military, and as they got in the military, you know, the military sort of brainwashed them and created a part of self that was really, you know, kind of a warrior that would murder and kill and would do it at all costs. And when they get in a corner, they turn that warrior on and they become ruthless and cruel. And, you know, part of self manifests themselves that is really dark. And so I find that it's really important for people to get to know their dark side and to begin to make friends with their dark side and see them as sort of protectors or failed protectors of sorts in order to be able to create intimacy. So what you're seeing then is, just to finish my outline, is in the morning we're going to work with the relationship and relationship skills. In the afternoon we're going to work with each individual and where and when they shut down and trying to help the self to differentiate. And then as the couple begin to have a healthier interchange and are able to love and care for one another, they often discover new levels of passion. And the goal then becomes the capacity for love as a developmental achievement. And so what they're doing is they're increasing their capacity to love not only each other in a romantic way, but to be able to connect with the universe. And so one of the reasons why we moved to Monterey is because it's not so hard. I mean, there's so much natural beauty, whether it be the ocean or whether it be the sea mammals or whether it be the vegetation, that you can just fall in love with poetry all over again and prose. And, you know, to begin to awaken yourself to what life is about and not, you know, become addicted to your work or addicted to your kids or addicted to some substance, but begin to open up the senses in the mindfulness exercises of beginning to be alive and vital as a human being. And so, you know, in the literature it's called making meaning out of suffering, but in effect it's a spiritual base. And the spiritual base is reminding oneself that there is some meaning to it all, there is some purpose to it all, and the purpose of loving is so that you grow as an individual, and you grow, and you help the individual grow back and forth. And then eventually to include the kids in this, so that the kids, they can look at their own parenting styles and begin to look at how so often the way they interact as a couple gets duplicated in their parenting style, and they're creating it in another generation. And so as you form a secure attachment with self, you're beginning to form a secure attachment with other, and also beginning to form secure attachments with your children, where instead of them needing to be replicas of you, being able to foster their individuality and their separateness and help them to become themselves. That might be a good time to take some questions.
Yeah.
Victor, you want to read some questions?
Yeah. It's heating up in here. Let me bring up a couple of these questions. George, who is a Presbyterian pastor, is working with an avoidance couple who blame one another. He says, I need help in getting them to look in a mirror. What should I say and or do?
You want to take it?
Why don't you start? That'll give me time to think.
That's a good one. And blaming one another it's a game that two people play. And what I like to do is have them use the relationship to look at themselves. And so if I come in, let's use Lori as an example. Let's say I come in and I say, you're making me angry. You're upsetting me. You're doing this to me. And then you're going to say, no, you're doing that to me. That is completely fruitless. It's a waste of time and energy. What I need to do is I need to come back, and my power of looking at myself, her power of looking at herself. So what is it that I'm doing right now that is contributing to the problem? Is my first question. And my second question is, what is going on for her? How is she feeling right now? And so whichever one I want to pick, let's pick the latter. If she's really angry at me, I'm curious about what's going on. And she may be scared that she's going to lose me. She may be frustrated that she feels so alone. She may be scared that I am not going to be able to make her happy. Whatever. But I try to look at it from her point of view, and I try to empathize with what she must be feeling right now. And that's very helpful. Then I spend some time focused on myself, and I say, what am I doing that's creating this distress? And why am I doing it? So I have a little thing that I say to myself, which is, what's up? What are you doing? Because to me, when there's conflict, there's a 200% contribution to the conflict. She has 100% contribution, I have 100% contribution. If I look at my 100%, she looks at her 100%, then it's very, very fruitful. If I'm blaming her and she's blaming me, we're not going to go anywhere. Now, I'll then coach the person to be able to do this. So, let's say I see the man individually, and I say something like, he comes in, she's this, and she's this, and she's this, and she's this. I'll listen to all that for about 20 minutes. And then when I'm finally done, I'm going to say, okay, let's get down to it. What she must be feeling is, and I might go in and discuss that, and I say, here's what you're doing right now, and here's what it is you're doing that drives her crazy. Do you know that you've asked her about money about 400 times? Do you know that you're out spending large sums of money, and you get really angry if she spends too much at the grocery store? You realize that you're not there until 8 o'clock at night. I'm going to be pointing these things out for him and say, how would you feel if this was going on? And helping him begin to see, so that he gets an idea of what his 100% contribution is to the problem, and can begin to better empathize with her. Now, Lori's going to do the same thing with her, and help her see what it is that's going on, and maybe tie it back to what happened in her own family of origin, and how it's a repeat of old kinds of things that have happened. And the result of that is to get each of them focused on themselves.
So let me add also that even though it's a good question, and that's a good preliminary response to how to handle it, of course, you never quite know until you're in the room with the couple, because you're not exactly sure what all that blame of one another, what function it's serving. Until you know the function it serves, it's a little hard to disentangle it. So here's a quick example. About 25 years ago, a couple came in to see us, and they sat there, and the man didn't say much, and the woman just was going on and on. She said, he doesn't take out the garbage. I have to ask him. And then he says, yes, I'll take it out. And he doesn't take it out. And then this, and then that, and then this, and then that. I mean, it went on for about 10 minutes without a breath. And then the man, we looked at him, and he shrugged his shoulders, and he went like this, like, see what I have to deal with? And believe me, we did. But sometimes, behind any really frustrated-looking partner is often a partner who's maybe really frustrated them. So, but you can't really get there. So she's the one we had to start with. So Mark said to me, and this was early in my career, so I thought, how in the hell will I do that? He said, you have to get her calmed down, and you have to get her to quit blaming him. You have to get her focused on her own change, and you have to get her taking really good care of herself, because he's not going to be bringing much more to the table yet for a little while. So let's get her off him and onto self-care. So because I didn't know it was impossible at the time, I actually managed to pull that off in about, we were doing, in about 6 sessions and several phone calls.
But what happened next with that couple was that he left the top off the medicine.
No, that's not what happened there. That was a different couple.
And the child got to the medicine. And so what I began to realize was that he was doing small things that would drive any person crazy. And when I went back into this family of origin, what we saw was that he had an enmeshed relationship with his mother, and she was telling him to brush his teeth at age 12 and controlling him in a variety of ways. And so he became incredibly recalcitrant. And so he had then recreated the environment with his wife that was similar to the relationship with his mother, and because it was familiar and safe. And when she started screaming at him like his mother screamed at him, he felt safe and comfortable. So I think what Lori's point is that you have to look at the context of these things rather than just sort of deal with them from a practical stance and understand that there's sometimes a deep structure.
Yeah, that was my point.
Victor?
Yeah, I personally have a burning question that I wanted to ask you, and many of our readers also have posed the same question. This is from Think and Grow Rich. And one of the things that Napoleon Hill talks about is this idea of sex transmutation. And ever since ancient times, the Chinese have talked about it. Napoleon Hill brings it up to the modern age. He's saying that we need to transmute our sexual energy. It's the most powerful energy in the universe. I was going to read a little paragraph. Among the greatest and most powerful of these stimuli is the urge of sex. When harnessed and transmuted, this driving force is capable of lifting men to that higher sphere of thought that enables them to master the sources of worry and petty annoyance that behest their pathway to the lower plane. Then he goes on to say, there never has been and never will be a great leader or artist lacking in this driving of sex. Now, this is a very old book. I disagree with him, because I believe if you have a good relationship with someone and you have a good sexual relationship with someone, that actually adds value to your ability to be able to harness this for your success and creativity. He was talking about transmuting that urge and driving it into your business. And I think that's one of the big problems today, is because so many people are like these alpha males. They're like neglecting their spouse or their partner, and they're not focusing on what really matters. What do you think about that?
So that's a lot like what Freud talked about originally. It's about how we take, what he thought to be the sexual drive, and then, what's the word for that? I'm getting older, so I forget these things, but we'll come back to them in a moment. No, and then we turn it into, we don't subvert it. Anyway, we sublimate it. We sublimate it. So we use that energy of the sexual drive to achieve, I suppose, more socially welcomed goals, like, you know, being a giant of industry. And I think that that model is died out a bit in terms of sublimation. I think that sexual energy is certainly a powerhouse of possibility, and it has because it's so powerful, it has great use and great misuse, like anything else powerful that human beings tap into. And I think I would agree with you, Victor, that, you know, the man who's likely to be the most fulfilled is the man who uses as much of his creative energy as possible in the ways in which, as Dr. Mark Galperin might frame it, his unique self is wired to use it. So each person's calibrated somewhat differently. So just what realms it gains expression in and in what degree is, of course, somewhat particular to the human being. But I think you're right in thinking that a robust ownership of one's creative capacity in all realms sounds like it's optimal.
What I would add is that, to me, the issue of this age is passion. As a marital therapist for 30 years, you know, it feels like passion's almost dead. And, you know, with so much of what's happened with people is that they've turned themselves into, you know, wheels that turn, and the relationship becomes similar, raising the kids becomes similar. And addiction is of our age, where people turn to alcohol and drugs every night, they turn to their work, they turn to movies, they turn to anything as a way of withdrawing and hiding, and it's a slow death. And so when you fall in love romantically, it ignites passion. It turns your engine back on. And what we do in a marital therapy retreat is we're trying to be able to turn the machinery back on, not just for love, not just for sex, but for a passion of the individual for what it is that excites them, that turns them on, that makes them alive. And I think you either have to have you know, any artist can turn to their art as a way of hiding, or they can turn to their poetry as a way of going outside and seeing all the beauty. And the mindfulness revolution that Eastern religions have brought into psychotherapy is a reawakening of people's passion and being able to look out through their senses and experience them more fully. And all psychotherapies now are incorporating mindfulness kinds of work to wake people up in a real core spiritual way, to ask themselves what their life is about, what's important to them, and if the way they're living their life is the way they want to be living their life.
Yeah, I love that answer, and I totally agree with you there. I think that you know, we're due for an update that bridges the gap between healthy relationship, attachment, and creativity, and that drive for success. And I think that's kind of a missing link, and I think you're pioneering the way for that. I'm really excited about that. We have another question that came in that's more of a clarification question. Some of our viewers actually are on mobile devices, and so they are listening to this broadcast live on their phone through headsets as they're driving on the car. One of them has just messaged me and posted a question here. And the question is, I missed the first 10 minutes, but from what I've heard, the goal is to use relationships and falling in love to create a secure attachment. I'm not clear on how you're defining attachment. And are you advocating attachment, or are you saying that my understanding is that attachment is something we should move away from and move more toward intimacy? So that's more of a clarification. How are you defining attachment? And should we move away from attachment? Or are you saying that we should move more toward attachment?
Yeah, I can see where the confusion would come in. I think it's how we're deploying the word attachment. We're kind of talking about attachment as sort of the innate apparatus within us. And since we're mammals, since we're primates, we're a species that typically we pair bond, and we also are kind of we're a troop species. So we're talking about attachment at more of that level, not attachment as in sort of a clinging, codependent, needy, determined to control a relationship because we have to hang on to it for dear life. We're talking about something a bit more naturalistic, in which attachment and intimacy wouldn't be all that as we're using them in this framework.
It's more like bonding.
Yeah.
When you have, the brain is built in all mammals to be as part of a troop species. And so we used to live in villages, and we had families, and we had connections. And whenever you were anxious or fearful or saw danger, you would turn to your troop, you would turn to your partner, and that would create safety, and it would create security. And we've now rearranged everything so that we live in apartments, and we're disconnected, and we're alone. And so our brains don't know what to do with that. And so we become crazy and fall in love with one person, because that one person then has to meet all of our needs for safety and security and family and so on. And so it puts too much pressure on the attachment system. And so when that happens and people disappoint us and hurt us, we isolate and we say, oh, I don't need anybody, I'll just live by myself, I'll live a life of solitude. Now, the result of that is depression and anxiety, and so then we go get medication. The whole thing is just nuts. And so what we're trying to be able to do is understand that and be able to say that turning to others as a source of safety and security is the natural anxiolytic. It's the natural antidepressant. And learning how to be able to use relationships as a form of safety is really critical, and that's called secure attachment. Secure attachment, in order to be able to create that when you've had a childhood which has been filled with danger, is that you have to begin to have a secure attachment with yourself as a requisite to have a secure attachment with others. And so we're working with intrapsychic intimacy to build relationship with self as a prerequisite for having interpsychic intimacy. But as Winnicott and Kohut have taught us in self-psychology, every day we have mirrors out there. And so whether people at work or whether it be friends we meet in the street, or whether it be lovers, people are continually mirroring an image back to us of who we are, whether we're smart, whether we're pretty, whether we're strong. And all those then feed back and feed into our sense of self. So there needs to be both inter and intrapsychic intimacy. So many of the people we see are misreading the cues of their environment continually, so that they have core beliefs of self that they're bad, defective, and damaged, and everything they read in their environment confirms their belief about self and increases their self-hatred. We have to change that interpersonal and intrapersonal environment so that they can begin to have not only accurate perceptions, but also create relationships with people who are capable of accurately mirroring a loving kind of environment. So many people pick partners or pick relationships with people they're going to mirror hatred and darkness, and sometimes they need to change that.
Yeah, so a person can have accurate perception, but also accurate reception, because a lot of people, it's not that the mirroring of some accurate truth about themselves isn't available from friends or lovers. It's in being able to have the receptor sites available to take it in for what it truly is, based on the schemas that interfere in a person thinking that they're usually it boils down to too little or too much. Too little of the things they should be, too much of the things they quote unquote shouldn't be.
I love that answer. I love that answer. I just wanted to acknowledge a few people who have written comments in here, and we didn't have a chance to do this at the beginning. Wanted to welcome Sarah Tate Merrill from Wichita, Kansas, and she's licensed to practice in Virginia. Mary Pellissier, she's an MD from Yakima, Washington. Bertine joining us from Lincoln, New England. What state is that? I'm sorry. I don't know all my 50 states where she's licensed to practice. And she's saying that you guys have been an invaluable benefit to her in years, and she's attended the workshop and seminars, and she's really grateful, and that she does not have to travel to reap the benefit of your expertise and experience. So that's just some of the nice comments. Shout out to Reed Finlayson from Nashville, Tennessee. And of course, my good friend and colleague George McClare, the Presbyterian minister, who is writing a number of books on this. He was watching this. He'll be on our hangout in a couple of weeks. And we have a few more questions. And one of the ones I wanted to talk about, this one is interesting. It's more of an inquiry. It's about the East meets West. In the Western world, we're more toward marriages and committed relationships, and there's a lot of emphasis in the media. I don't know if you've ever seen this BBC documentary called The Century of the Self, but that was one of my favorite programs that talks about this challenge in the West. However, in the East, more like in Buddhism and Hinduism and the Eastern traditions and Confucius and the Asian side, it's all about non-attachment. It's about detachment. It's about this other thing. And it seems like we have this dichotomy that's created between East and West. Is there anything you have to comment or say about that? Because that's one of the questions. Like they say Buddhism's all about non-attachment. Buddhism says we even shouldn't move towards desirous attachment. So how could someone who is like a scholar now of Eastern and Western traditions cope with this dichotomy between like their spiritual faith on one level is saying, well, we should not be attached, whereas the Western world here in America is saying, well, you got to get attached, because we got to have the baby engine working, and we got to have the ring engine and the diamond industry working and all the other industries working.
James Gilligan said, we need love like we need oxygen. And I really believe that he's right, that we need love like we need oxygen. And there are environments where there is a village, and in those villages people are raised together for life. They have connections, they have family they live with, and they have a strong extended family, and they live in a tribe. I've been in Europe where at night everyone comes out into the street and drinks beer and talks to each other and has social relationships. And the environment we've created in America is unnatural. In Monterey, there are so many people who come here from other cultures, and they say, you people are so unhappy. I want to go back home. I was poor back at home, but I was happy because I had family and I had love. And in this unnatural environment, it's pushed romantic love to the forefront, where we have to get so many of our needs met through loving one person. And the result of that is, divorce every 7 years, is that you get hurt terribly. And in that pattern, the person you built your life with then sues you and tries to take everything you've got in court. And, the result of that is just pain and agony. And so the result is that people have ambivalence about getting committed to somebody, yet, 97% of people are still married. And so what happens is that as a result of that, some people move to this Eastern tradition of trying to be able to live by oneself, and a solitude. And more we're seeing this where people, particularly women, are saying, I don't need a man to control me. I'm tired of it. You know, I'm going to go live by myself and not have an intimate relationship. I don't need anybody else telling me what to do. And then they create a life with 2 or 3 good friends and so on. And I'm all for that if it works. If you can get your needs for love met through 3 or 4 good friends, that sounds really good too. But then you're missing sexuality sometimes. And so, as you said earlier, sexuality is a really important passionate energy that runs through us. And I think a relationship without sex is missing something important. And so we're left with, what could we do to make the romantic relationship not so difficult and painful as a society? It's a cultural problem that we have here. And most people use it as an individual and suffer from it and go through a divorce, but they don't see the bigger perspective of the fact that we need love in order to be able to thrive. And the reason why, 70% of our culture is on antidepressant is because we've made it so difficult to be able to establish and maintain love.
And as if that wasn't a lengthy enough response, I have some thoughts too.
I love it. Yeah, please share them.
Okay. So, when we use the word expert, it's a pretty limited application of the term because we're all still learning, I hope, every day of our lives from now till whenever, all the way through. So I don't know the answer to this. Here are just some thoughts on it. One, sometimes things that seem dichotomous ultimately converge somewhere down the line farther than where we can see and cease to become dichotomous. So I know, for example, in the spiritual sense, I think there was a book written by a friend and colleague with whom I'm writing something currently. In one the spirituality book in 2013, it's called Your Unique Self, A Radical Guide to Personal Enlightenment. It really talks about this sort of split between East and West spiritually and what the convergence of the two might look like, or sort of the transcendence of the seeming dichotomy of the two might be more accurate. And that would be unique self, so that one doesn't have to either yield up a sense of connectedness with all, and one doesn't have to yield up a sense of the unique as being simply some narcissistic investment. And so I like that in the spiritual realm, and I think it's a really important progression. And then, another interesting book that deals with various different approaches to sexuality and passion and intimacy and love, and considering it from a lot of different points of view, is a book called Challenge of the Heart by John Welwood, who I also have the pleasure of meeting. And I've never found a book in all the years since reading that one that I thought included more interesting inquiries and thoughts from fascinating people from different cultures and different eras even on those subjects. So I think everyone sort of begins where they are, and so where a person needs to be to get to the next place will differ for each person. So probably before a person can learn to relinquish attachment, they have to be capable of attachment. And again, I'm not sure we're actually using the word attachment in the same precise way. But so I think wherever a person's path lies is just going to be highly individualized. And again, there are many ways to love, and there are many ways to run from love. And some people, get lead to a nunnery instead of dealing with it. And then some people really have a calling that causes them to be in a place where relationships with other human beings at a certain level are not the thing that they're having to challenge in this particular lifetime. So I think it's a very difficult question to have one answer to, but those are some general thoughts.
We need to end because of time. I wanted to say two things before we end. One was that we have a second webinar on April 23rd, which is going to be terrific. It's going to be on our new work on addictions. And second thing is if you have a couple who are not benefiting from individual therapy once a week, think about going into this intensive format. It's very, very powerful. Or send them on vacation to Monterey, and we have a place for them to stay, and we work with them really intensively. And thank you all for attending.
Yeah, I really appreciate it. It's been a pleasure, and the questions have been really thought-provoking. And I want to say, too, because we talked about male-female couples, that, of course, just as an initial framework of introducing the model, of course, we deal with same-sex couples as well, and all kinds of variations on themes of that nature.
Thank you, Victor.
Well, you're very, very welcome. And I'm really looking forward to the webinar. Let me reiterate that. That's going to be April 23rd, 1 p.m. And it'll be at the exact same website, same place, same time, just 2 weeks from now. And then we will let you know by email how you can access the replays or any other information about the Marriage Therapy Institute. I want to make sure you visit marriagetherapyinstitute.com. And on the right-hand side, you'll see contact us for a free consultation. You put in your name, your email address, and phone number, and someone from Mark's office will get back to you right away and schedule that free consultation. Also, they do offer marriage retreats, and that is what we've been talking about here, is in 7 days, you will have literally a year's worth of value delivered to you. It's invaluable, and one of the people here today had attended some of those retreats. So on that note, I wanted to adjourn the webinar, and if you're watching the replay, please write your questions below in the comments, or just share this on Facebook and let your friends know about this great team that is revolutionizing sexuality here in 2015. I'm Victor Grant of the I call it Success Mastermind. I call it the Sex Mastermind. We should actually create a new one called the Sex Mastermind Hangout. Bidding you live long and prosper, and say bye-bye, everybody.
Where can we get a hat like that?
You have to come to the Dickens Fair in San Francisco. Take care, everyone. Bye now.